I started with the campaign in September 2017. So I had met with Lucy, and she basically visited an organization I was working for at the time, which is Caris Haringey, a local homeless families project. And we basically support homeless families locally with advice on housing, immigration, welfare entitlements, and also education. What drew me was particularly in respect to destitute families locally. So I was witnessing that there was a dramatic increase of destitute families, who actually could not really receive support when approaching to access services from the local authority. So when I sort of had a dramatic increase of cases, but also very severe cases in relation to child protection, domestic violence, and severe destitution. So we're talking about children sleeping on night buses or storage units. I sort of realized there was a really bad problem, in relation to the policies that were implemented locally, but also in relation to the national sort of legislative scheme in general. So that's really drew me to the campaign, because there was a real focus on protecting the dignity and promoting welfare and respect for all of us locally, and particularly in relation to migrants and refugees. So I've been working in Haringey since 2010. And I would say that we really need to understand the austerity measures that have been taken since 2010. To understand how the hostility sort of kicked in relation to the nature of the policies and legislations. And so once the austerity agenda or program was actually implemented from 2010, and we've seen as practitioners changes in relation to the welfare system, which sort of gave way to the Welfare Reform 2012 Act, there was a massive cuts on welfare benefits provided to families who needed support. So that was the starting point. Families who actually were in work were finding themselves destitute in relation to the fact that they could no longer afford to pay for their rent or to afford food and meet their living needs. So that's when around 2013, 2014. And at the time, I was actually witnessing a trend in EEA national families, so families where EEA nationals were actually involved, who could not really access services and find themselves being destitute because they had no longer access to public funds. And that was as a result of the changes in the legislation as part of the Welfare Reform Act 2012. So it started in 2013, 2014. Then in 2014, 2015, there was another shift. So we had families that were given restrictions on the immigration visas, so on the leave to remain in the United Kingdom, so basically on the permission to stay in the country. They were prevented from accessing public funds, and it's created a category of people with leave to remain, so permission to stay in the United Kingdom, but barred from accessing certain types of services and support. So those families were basically being kept from accessing mainstream support. But when children were involved and they were living in the local area, if they were found to be in need, so those children, then the local authority had a duty to carry out an assessment to establish those needs, because local authorities under the Children's Act 1989 have a duty to promote the welfare of children living in the local area. And that, in some cases, involves carrying out an assessment to establish the needs of the children. So the other aspect is that we had a very problematic practice, which was to have embedded home office officers within children and young people services, which means that within social services offices, when a person or family would approach to receive support, they will be interviewed by Home Office officers, sorry. So that was in 2015 that we started seeing that trend. And it was piloted in different boroughs in London. It was not generally rolled out. So certain boroughs in London were concerned, including Haringey. So that basically created a gatekeeping culture among social services, but also for families who were scared to approach the local authority for support because they were concerned about being interviewed by a Home Office officer. They were concerned about how the information they will be provided will be dealt with. And actually, as advocates, as migrants' rights advocates, we had no clear understanding of under what authority the local authority was acting by employing directly a Home Office officer, but also we had no understanding of how the information would be used by the Home Office officer. Is it to what purpose, and who would it be reporting to? So that was a very severe concerns that we had, but also because we were seeing an influx in families approaching us because they were too afraid to approach social services. So as I mentioned, we've seen cases of children having to sleep in night buses, but also in McDonald's, which were open 24 hours, in Tottenham police stations, in hospitals, A&E. It was actually really, really problematic. Families who were approaching us were for very various backgrounds. We have people who were working full-time, part-time. We had people who were, single families, all single families, single parent families, or with both parents. We have families who were EU nationals, as I mentioned. We had families who were local families. They're all local families. They're all Haringey residents because Caris provides families to support to local families. Some of them were not in work. And I have to say that I think there is a highly discriminatory element in those policies because most of those families, I have to say, were single parent families, and I mean single women. So single women who were in work, some of them were in work working part-time, and for obvious reasons related to childcare, could not afford to place their children in full-time childcare, and actually were finding themselves destitute with their children because they were not able to obtain accommodation or meet up their living needs if they were able to meet the rent payments for their accommodation. So that's the type of profile that you could find. Haringey Welcome campaign helped in, or I think is going to help even more in many ways. I think the first thing that's really, really important is locally to spread the message that we're all welcome here. And welcome, the way I understand it, is basically making sure that there is a sense of solidarity, that, circumstances sometimes goes beyond our control. We do not choose where we're born, we do not choose our nationality, let alone, where our parents are born, So I think there is a very powerful message of humility. It humbles one to actually think that, others understand that, we're not in control of different things in relation to nationality or where someone is born. So that's one thing in relation to that. It's really, I think, important that locally people know that even though statutory services or official bodies may be sort of carrying practices or policies that may not be, welcoming to others, locally, neighbours, your neighbours, people who live in your community, actually, send a different message, a different narrative to you as having a place in your community. So that's really helpful. I think that's one thing. And then the second thing is that the campaign is actually looking at change, effective change and meaningful change. So at the moment we're working on an integration strategy, an inclusion strategy, I would say, which will actually spread this welcome spirit to actually change practices, to change mindsets, so that when anyone approaches, because it's not directly directed just to refugees and asylum seekers or migrants, but to everyone, regardless of backgrounds, of any sorts, that everyone should receive the same treatment, an equal, fair, and just treatment. The things that I've sort of done with Haringey Welcome was to give a practical perspective in relation to the impact of hostile environment policies, austerity locally, to give concrete sort of insights in relation to what are the challenges that advocates locally face on an everyday basis when supporting local migrants. And I think because the other aspect of my work is more related to social inclusion and social innovation, so maybe when it will be time for us to be working a lot more concretely on the drafting of the integration/inclusion policy, I think my role will be to again give that perspective, but on a more practical level and strategic level. So we first heard of a hostile environment in 2012. When then Prime Minister, no, actually, she was Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May, sort of spread the word that she wanted to create here in the United Kingdom a hostile environment for illegal immigrants. We don't really use the term illegal immigrant. I mean, practitioners don't tell to use that word because we just leave that authority to the courts to decide if someone is here lawfully or not. So I think what she meant by that is that she was referring to undocumented migrants, which means people who have not yet been given permission to remain in the United Kingdom. And there could be many reasons why a person may be undocumented. It could be a change of circumstances, as I explained. It could be domestic violence. It could be lack of access to legal representation, which is a very, very problematic issue here locally, actually, I have to say, but more broadly on national level. And also, maybe someone that's been brought up here. We've seen the case with the Windrush generation issue. And if what she actually said, the statement was that the hostile environment will be focusing on undocumented migrants. In practice, it's affecting everyone. It's affecting British nationals, British children, as I mentioned, because we were talking about destitute families earlier, and also EA nationals, so nationals from the EU community, also people with leave to remain, so lawfully in the United Kingdom. There's two ways in which the hostile environment policies are actually operating. So first of all, there's been a massive sort of change in the increase of powers of Home Office to collect data generally. So we've seen it with the attempt, I have to say an attempt now, because thankfully, thanks to migrant groups and advocates, it's now been challenged legally. So there was an attempt to collect data through the NHS Digital. So people who will be approaching for healthcare will be facing the prospect of having the data shared with the Home Office. So there was this. And there was also in relation to sharing data of children attending school. So there was, to me, an attempt to track undocumented migrants through their children, through checking the children's nationality, children's ethnicity, and sometimes requesting for national insurance numbers of their parents, which was really concerning. And so Liberty and BC School Campaign have managed to challenge this legally, and we now know that it's no longer taking place. But there are also other concerns in relation to bank checks. So banks have been sort of given instructions to carry out immigration checks on people who wanted to open a bank account. And that as well has been suspended in light of the Windrush scandal. So that was back in May this year, that the checks are now longer being carried out by a bank and civil society accounts. Also in relation to landlords, so we've had now the instruction of the right to rent. So the right to rent is basically an obligation for landlords to perform immigration checks, again, on people who wanted to rent their properties. Now, we can all think that, carrying out immigration checks might be something that's pretty straightforward. It is not in practice. An immigration check is very complicated. It can be in different, types of documents, and sometimes you need to put them together. It's not an easy task. So it is fair to say that considering the sanctions for not being compliant, that one will want to take an easy road and say, well, I'm only going to accept people who approach with a British passport or an EA passport, for instance. And because I don't want to, carry out any further checks, I'm just not going to be, in practice, allowing someone to rent my property if they're not British or if they're not EU nationals. I think welcome means one thing, two main things, let's say. First, I think it's really about making a place for someone. And I think I will explain myself. I think there is a lot of sort of talks around what integration means, what inclusion means. And I don't really like hearing the word integration. I think I'm a bit puzzled about it. I'm a bit confused. To me, integration is really about, we're giving you that spot and that's it.
It's your responsibility to integrate
Exactly.
yourself.
It is your responsibility to integrate yourself. The word inclusion, the word welcome means something different. It means we're making a place for you, So we're seeing it as an equal.
Yeah.
And that's the main difference. And that's what I like about the Haringey Welcome message. That's very powerful to me. And the other thing I think is, again, around the solidarity, the humility of recognizing that, we are not under control of, where we're born, our nationalities, our parents' nationalities, And also it's a recognition of universality of, what a migrant is, what migrants are. We are just human beings, and I'm talking from a personal perspective as a migrant. We are simply human beings, and that's recognizing that. And I think there is something very disturbing in having policies that are denying us this. There's something very disturbing in that. For two main reasons. Why? Because we're living in a democratic country. So not protecting a human being is very problematic. It is actually questioning the nature of our governments, the nature of the democracy we're living in. And also because once we let the door open to any form of discrimination targeting any type of groups, we can be sure that at the end of the day, the general population will be affected, And I think Brexit was a wonderful example. As a EU national myself, I've been sort of involved with various EU nationals, and for a very, very long time, they were under the impression that, well, they're EU nationals, so there's no risk to them. They feel pretty safe. But when the Brexit vote came out, well, they were the first people to be very worried what's going to happen to our jobs, what's going to happen to our children, what's going to happen to our houses, what's going to happen to our lives. And that is very relevant. That is a time for all of us to come together. And now most EU nationals understand how it feels to be considered like someone else, someone that's not the same, someone that's from somewhere else. Yeah. So I hope that it will actually show to everyone that once the door to discrimination of any kind towards any group is open, it is everyone's duty to make sure that we stand, as like one to stop it. I think initially the idea was, one, how are we going to make that happen, that hostility? How is it going to be done? I think one was to basically deprive migrants, or just preventing migrants from living a basic life in the UK. You can't open a bank account, you cannot rent a property, you cannot register your kids to school, you cannot drive in the UK, or you cannot, what's the other one? You cannot access healthcare in the UK. And then the other thing was to prevent people from coming altogether. And I think that's when, we can relate that to Brexit, the Brexit vote, and say, well, we are not really welcoming everyone, or we're only picking and choosing the one that we want. Which brings me back to the message of welcome. The message of welcome of this campaign is really important because it refuses to create a hierarchy amongst people, amongst any migrants, amongst any group, amongst any human being. And I think that's the beauty of the welcome message.